I'll never forget the day I read a book. It was contagious, 70 pages. There were pictures here and there, so it wasn't hard to bear. The day I read a book.
First of all, welcome everybody to the October Wafer-Thin books discussion. We are really privileged and delighted this month to have the treat that we're not only talking about Panthers and the Museum of Fire, but we have an opportunity to talk about it with the author herself, Jen Craig, who has very graciously agreed to join our discussion and actually even do a little reading from the book. So I don't know, I have to say, just as a preface, I read this book on a Kindle during lockdown in the UK when my wife and I were stuck there. And it was really quite disturbing. I actually had to stop reading it at night because it started eating into my brain like a worm, I have to say. It has sort of a mesmeric effect. And the last thing I needed at that time, and I think many of us, was things for, I already am a prolific ruminator, a virtuoso ruminator, and your prose just tapped into that into a big way. So it was a little bit actually creepy to come back to it after a distance of a few years, and because it brought back that experience of feeling, the world is coming to an end, and racing thoughts were, for me at least, a constant thing, day in and day out. Not that any of that's changed, I guess. So what I thought we would do is, if you don't mind, Jen, could we start with your reading, or maybe you'd like to talk a little bit about, I mean, I'm sure many of us are interested in knowing, where did this book come from? Because it's clearly the work of a lot of, I get the impression this wasn't like whipped off on the fly, that this is something that had been in gestation for quite a long time before you kind of found the right form to work with. So could you tell us a little bit about, what was the lead up to the book?
Yes. Gestation's probably the word. I think that's how I write. I become sort of haunted or inhabited by something. I guess I could call it an image, or images, but it's a bit more embodied or inchoate than that. In some ways, it kind of, there's a couple of things. It relates to the first book that I published since the accident, where I had this experience of kind of laboring to bring a kind of book into some kind of form, and that was a familiar thing to me. It's always been kind of my way. I become taken or obsessed with something, and bringing it to form, getting the voice, takes time. And then, yeah, I found there was this moment where I was able, I still feel it, like I sort of cracked what I was doing in half, the previous book, and I just flicked it's like you have a sort of an object which has a skin on the outside, and I put the underside of that skin over the top of it, and the whole thing suddenly was completely rewritten. I remember trying to account for it by saying the only words in common with the previous one are, words like and the and is. But in some sense, it connected to the thing that was taking me there in the first place. And somebody somebody remarked afterwards, although it didn't, it had a kind of small splash. No, not even a splash. It's kind of like a little drop. Here, it was published by a very small firm here. And but somebody else sort of remarked on it being a breakthrough. This word breakthrough was something, as you will know, you've just read the book. So I was trying to understand what on earth had happened. What was this breakthrough? What it is about a form that just needs to be its own thing, because that's always been what I wanted to do, make something which in some sense is a kind of thing, an object, an experience come to life. So that was part of it. And also, I guess, the sign. I mean, this sign did exist. It still exists in half, because even as I was writing Panthers, the sign changes, which the narrator acknowledges at the beginning. And it hasn't changed since then. And there is actually, I don't know if you're aware of, there is a so-called book trailer from the first edition, the Spineless Wonders edition. It's on Vimeo. I'm not sure how easily searchable, but the person who made the book trailer got hold of Google image of the original sign, so you can actually see that sign in it. I don't know, magic it seemed to me that he could find it, because by the time I realized it wasn't there. So he layers my voice, he layers the experience of the tunnel, the walking through the same tunnel. And so I was always astonished by that sign too, what it meant so much. But again, I was trying to understand that. So I guess the book sort of developed in a way of trying to make sense of an experience I couldn't yet put into words until I found the words, until I found the form, until I found the voice. Many, many other layers in there. I think there's many, many traces of experiences that I'm trying to build into one experience.
Your narrator talks about having read Sarah's book, manuscript, and had a breakthrough herself. Is that sort of related? I mean, to what extent is the Jen Craig who tells us, who lets us into our thoughts, the Jen Craig who's writing the book?
It's not exactly me. I mean, as you'll see, that I never say I'm Jen in the book, but I talk about the diet company name, which there's a kind of rub between two separate objects, and between there we imagine, maybe I invite you to imagine that the narrator is me. And I am writing out from the experience of reading certain kinds of books where they are this experience, and there's a kind of simplicity, and I go, that's it, I don't want to write anything else. I don't care, everything, is it Paul Auster talks about everything center, none of the bits that we think we need to write, just the essential. And I've had those experiences when I read certain works and I go, yes, that's all writing needs to be. So yeah, that comes from the lived experience of feeling that kind of, the impact of that permission of encountering a text like that. But of course, as you know, in the book, it comes from somebody that's written by somebody that the narrator's marginalized in her existence and has, in some sense, a horror of, and it brings up so many other things for her. Yeah.
And Sarah herself is marginalized as well. I mean, is there a connection in that seems, even though, the narrator is anorectic and Sarah has gained weight, but we get the impression of two women who have, really struggled to, maintain a foothold in society without being completely erased.
Yeah. Yeah. And very differently. They're like, in some ways, Sarah's like a ballast for something that well, the narrator writes about her arrival at the high school is there was something that was helpful for the narrator, even if there's something that doesn't make sense about this person. That person, I mean, also sort of that character attaches herself to a kind of one of those public service sort of jobs that give a security weight, if you like, and contain her in a way that there's sadness, I guess, because there's a sense of immensity of who this person could be, and that's part of the sadness and disbelief, actually, the narrator finds when she discovers she's the only friend. I mean, the narrator said, surely not, surely not. After all this time, she's the only one that's been invited to the funeral. Yeah, it's the reality.
I mean, you can see that. I mean, it gives her family such an easy out to say, oh, okay, we can check the box that says she has a friend, even though, it's sort of a shock to the narrator to find that that's the label that's been put on this relationship, which was non-existent
non-existent and avoidant too.
Yeah.
Avoidant.
So we could easily run with the hour on this, but you agreed to do a little reading, and Jen was a guinea pig enough that she let me pick the passage, which I'll let you do the reading and then I'll explain why I picked the passage. But I'd love to hear what you were thinking about when you were writing it as well.
Okay, so it's from, I don't know if you've got the book.
I think I've got the same.
Got the 0-gram edition. I've got my other editions. I think they're the same. So near the bottom of page 87. Okay, it doesn't need any introduction. At university, I'd become impressed by the way that the others around me, my friends, my acquaintances, actually, I now corrected myself, seemed able to conduct very brief conversations with other people as walking along they might chance to meet when they move between buildings. It was the nature of these conversations that had impressed me, I know. The way the simplest exchange of how are you or what's been happening would engender the lightest, most effortless, but very elegant small exchange of words, the way something other, quite beautiful and detailed, would arise with a few choice phrases, and phrases which had their own momentum, their own limitations, their own inbuilt intuition for rhythm and decay. For the first time, it occurred to me to want to know how to make these same kinds of conversations. For no other reason, I was remembering now as I moved further into the thick of the commuters in the tunnel. For no other reason than for the most aesthetic of reasons, the same reasons that might lead somebody else to learn how to dance a tango in the way the tango needed to be danced. I wanted to be able to conduct these same kinds of conversations, these very lightest, most elegant of conversations, and so without pausing to worry about my ability to control them. I began to use these same phrases, these how are yous and what's been happenings, and actually became skilled at fashioning the fiction of my replies. Nobody, I must have worked out for myself from pure observation, referred to any pain or difficulty except through the lightest of references. Any pain or difficulty seemed always to be transformed into an entertaining lilt of sentences, a single lilt of words with the simplest of grammar, and the more expert the speaker, the more effortless the sentence, with the most expert decorating their difficulties by adding a short and single subordinated clause. A 3-day headache, for example, would become the prelude for at last being up to a full week of partying again. The funeral of an aunt would be inserted into a list of comic woes, and for no other reason than to get a laugh and a cheerful reply. All pains or difficulties had to have that function, I must have realized, thinking of it now. And so each one needed to be managed in the most skillful way possible. So it became the incongruous component, the one that got the laugh. I became expert in this dallying of my difficulties. I even invented them or embellished. Everything was embellishment. In a lilting series of sentences, each one delivered or performed like a dance. And my reward, as it seemed, was not only the satisfaction of the dance, but also the earning of imagined accolades of the, she's great, she's so laid back, she makes me laugh, or so I was remembering as I heard, from far back in the tunnel behind me, the man with the unknown instrument in the stickered over case, a kind of lyre, I thought, as I recalled what I'd seen in his hands, or a flat kind of harp, beginning to play something that could have been jazz, unless it were another busker playing, someone I had failed to notice. And yet in thinking about this dance of sentences, I've concertinaed many months. I've concertinaed many processes too, because I actually don't remember connecting what I was doing with the sentences and the earning of the titles of great and laid back, which I evidently craved. It is always afterwards that such connections become obvious. And in thinking them through, even writing them down on screens such as this one, such connections seem so inevitable as to suggest that they had been obvious at the time. I've always concertinaed events and concocted connections. I'm always being duped into thinking that there is somewhere a clear connection between all events and outcomes in my life. But in reality, nothing was obvious then and is not obvious now. And is still not obvious, as I can see now 4 years later. I make connections between one event or series of events and the apparent outcome in my head, and this connection, seemingly obvious, has always been false. All my life, I've witnessed my brain working in this way, I was thinking, as I got closer and closer to the hub of the station near the end of the tunnel. Even now, I'd clearly decided to walk to the cafe, setting off much earlier than I might have needed to set off for that particular cafe, so that I might have time to turn over all the thoughts in my head before seeing the sister again and handing over the manuscript. All my life, or at least since the time that I was anorexic, when to walk was the ultimate pleasure, the only existence possible. I've attempted to understand myself by taking walks, and I've always arrived somewhere with apparently more simply formulated thoughts and a sense that thinking is possible and that I know what I'm doing, or at least what I've been trying to do. I make connections as I walk, I was realizing, as I got closer and closer to the end of the tunnel. And I'm always being buoyed by the unexpected, serendipitous connections between one train of thought and another. And yet the connections that I fashion in my brain through the repetitive, inevitable rhythm of my walking could well have no reality, no veracity, I was realizing, or trying to realize, outside these peculiar ambulatory conditions of my mind.
Thank you. That's so wonderful. I have to say, I've read a lot of stream of consciousness writing, and many of us who love modernist writing have read that. I don't think anything's come as close to capturing it for me as many passages in this book, but that one in particular. There's so much going on, and it's so, I mean, for me, one of the things I love about this book is it's so convincingly the way my thoughts run very often. And I think that's one of the things that I really like. You're noting places as you're walking by isn't done in the way that a realistic novelist might do it, or many other novelists would do it, where you would stop kind of the train of thought. So we see things as we would see them walking along, which is glances and glimpses and fragmentary little impressions, and move on. And
Yeah.
it's done in such a brilliant way. I really admire what you've been able to pull off here. But I wanted to say why I picked that particular passage is when I read that both times, my mind kept screaming, Henry James, because, James has, at his either his best or his worst, depending on what you think about James, but he has that microscopic examination of little interactions. And so, like your thoughts about coming up with the light, effortless conversation, which I think is something I know as an introvert I practiced, it wasn't, it takes an effort to appear like a casual, normal person in many day-to-day settings. And that either comes easily to you or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, you do pay attention to things like how people phrase things and how do you mention that your aunt died without dumping a bag of emotional concrete in somebody else's lap, which is what those are never designed for that sort of thing. You're not actually supposed to go into anything, deep and substantial in those interactions.
Yes, yes, that's right. This kind of learning the rules of what's supposed to be said and not supposed to be said, or how. It's not easy. Yeah.
I think that passage also, I use the expression with you and in other cases of kind of Mobius strip prose, which again I think is so, such an accurate way to capture how our thoughts go on, because we do that, we end up chewing that one thought over and over and it comes back, but it's not exactly the same, but it's sort of like the same. And to do that without becoming, tedious. I mean, did you find that you had to work your sentences? Some of them they're fascinating because some of them are pretty succinct and others are so sinuous and flowing that, is that something that you found, was that part of your breakthrough, is getting to be able to write prose like that, or was it at the abandonment of kind of the plot structure sorts of things?
Good question. I think could say a fault. It's kind of my tendency to to want to put in those details. In conversation, yeah, the same self that might need to know that. No, that's not okay. You don't do that. So I guess finding a form that felt more like how reality felt for me was the breakthrough. Something that could, I think that was my frustration with so-called sort of lyrical realism, or whatever it's called, realist sort of narratives. They never felt real to me. I mean, to me, they feel the greatest of artifice. I mean, it's so, I still have that experience. I can open a book. It's not all. I mean, and it's not even necessarily the so-called sort of art, what I read to be artificial kind of ways of indicating a world, because there can be writers who do that and I still feel reality in some kind of sense, or I feel something. But I realized that I needed to find a language for that. And it was, the breakthrough had the experience of like breaking through a crust into where there seemed to be so much possibility. It's one of those things I have to work with and be careful of, because there could be a possibility all my text could be just sort of weighed down with the infinite detail of where that would take me. So it's the breakthrough was a moment of going, oh, right, yes, the inside, if you like, of the skin is more real than the apparently normal outside. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What I found astonishing about this, all three of your books, particularly, I've never seen anyone do it so well, the ability to kind of inhabit in the prose 3 times simultaneously, because there's the moment that the character is in as they're walking, and the memories from multiple different times that flood back to them at the same time, and the kind of rehearsed imagined future that they are contemplating, and to be able to juggle three of those simultaneously, but with absolute clarity, so the reader is in no way confused or lost. As I say, it's quite astonishing. I've never read anything that is able to do that so well. Yeah, I'm amazed, very envious.
Thank, thank you. I'm not aware of. Well, I know it's very important to me to have those distinctions clear, because early on in the editing for the Australian edition of Spineless Wonders, there was some misunderstanding between the editor, that first editor, and me, where I realized, she's not feeling those. I had to argue, because there might be kind of so-called normal clarification of sentences which would get rid of that, one of those like silvery layers. Cannot do it. Nothing would make sense after that. So I remember having to, or I was asked to plot out, I don't know how I did it, but plot out something about what's going on where. So I think I did it in lines. I don't know how I did it. And having to argue English grammar. And then in the end, perhaps that was, perhaps it was, I think it was a misunderstanding. I think once she realized, and then there was a different editor. So I sort of fought for that, because it would not make sense to cut those. And for me, they're essential. They're essential. It just doesn't make sense without it.
I think that's one of the reasons that the prose is such for me, captured so convincingly the process of thinking, because, when we have memories, it's not like a film where we have a flashback and now stops, and then we go through some sort of an orderly replay. And in fact, my thoughts, just for myself, there are probably 36 times a day I think of various intersections, literally street intersections and stretches of road that I walked on or drove along in my life. They just pop in. I don't know why, but that's the way they pop in. And again, I think you captured that sort of in a way that's realistic, and yet we do make sense of the backstory of the narrator, at least in substantive ways, and we understand Sarah's story as it's played out. And of course, we follow your narrative of walking through the city from start to finish. So there is a lot, that is actually, could be, diagrammed out, so to speak. But it's not, it's very subtle.
Thank you.
I love
them. It is as possible. Sorry, I did interrupt. I want, I guess I'll finish that thought, and please, I'm interested in what the other person about speaking, I'm interested in what you were saying too, about to ask me, but yes, I think I wanted simplicity to allow that, if you like, the complexity to hang, in fact, certain kinds of language can irritate me if well, that's a whole other discussion. Sorry. I think Julia was going to ask something.
I was just going to say that's why I love the metaphor of the concertina so much here, because of the, constant flow back and forth, which is what produces the music. And then sort of juxtaposing that against the forward motion of the walking, I think is really powerful and subtle, but resonant. Yeah, that really spoke to me. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think also what I wanted to ask about your technique of repeating certain phrases and words and kind of like working through them again and going back, that repetition, that sort of folding back upon, was that something that you found kind of just flowed as you were tapping into the writing, or is that something that is more by design?
Ooh. I think my experience, especially writing that one, was kind of a permissive thing, allowing it to flow in, allowing it to flow. I think in my next book, I think I was a little bit more or aware of, oh, am I going to do that again? Because it's like how I write keeps evolving, but with the same intention. So I think I had that once with this work, once I could find that channel, if you like, I did sort of permit it to go, especially as sometimes when I read over, I go, oh, I might, might have changed something. There's not much of that, because that's part of it's part of what the voice is doing, trying to make sense, and part of the repetition. I mean, steps repeating too. And also as ways of holding down kind of points of thought. Sometimes the repetitions help that. So I can see that.
Oh, absolutely. Was this a book that kind of emerged in the process of writing, or do you feel, was it something you kind of saw as a whole when you began?
Both, I guess. What I know about saw as a whole, I felt it needed to be a whole. Needed to be whole and be layered or multiple at the same time. And I wasn't sure how I'd do that or how I could get there. There's so many moments where, when I was reflecting on how this book came about, sometimes they're chance things when I just, had a chance experience where I suddenly realized, yes, this is part of this, even though it's a chance experience. One of the experiences I was reflecting on was, even the use of my, apparent name or was some years before. It was first published in Australia in 2015, but some years before, when I'm still writing it, though I had a good draft by the time my first one was published. Everything's quite slow in this process. But I went to theatre, and it was kind of experimental theatre, and I think it was a semi-private showing, I'm not sure, the performance space in Sydney, and as we arrived, our names had to be checked off. We had to sort of go to somebody and then take a seat, and the person looked down and said Jenny Craig, and that gets announced to everybody in the theatre. And the mortification came up for me. So much mortification. I was thinking, why would they call me that? Why? And I felt so exposed, sitting there, trying to make sense of this, multiple experiences going on inside me after being announced so publicly. And when I did notice my notebook afterwards, I realized not long after, a few months after, I could feel the shape of the end of this book. Somehow it enabled me to think, wow, I'm just going to put this in somehow, this whole thing of what it means to have this name, something that's not just a private. There are a lot of private, that's how it seems to me anyway, private jokes in this book. But I guess that's kind of one of them. Kind of
I have to say
experience. So sorry, yeah.
I was just going to say, was it last year or early this year when Jenny Craig, the business, collapsed? And I remember thinking, yes, the narrator of this novel will be extremely, extremely satisfied by this.
Yes. Yes. No, I got so used to it and I'd adapted in my life, but yeah. Yes, I remember that. Yeah, there was collapse. And I'm not sure how influential that business was elsewhere in the world, but here it was very big.
Yeah, it's all over TV, everything.
Yeah, like in the train, if you like, to the mountains on the Western Line would go past. I don't know whether maybe it was Penrith, and you could see Jenny Craig, very large letters. You used to be able to see that on a building. You know, it was everywhere visible. And yet there's this kind of dogged, I was going to say belligerent, but maybe it is dogged part of me that thought, I'm going to hang on to my name. I could, right, because in fact, there is, I actually did, not long after that she sort of landed into the Australian sort of economic environment, I did actually change my first name for a short time. I wasn't going to change my last name, goodness knows why, but and there's still a couple of people who know me as that. Not that I've seen them for a long time, because my first short story ever was published under this other name. And I think I interacted with these people as if I was this other person, but then I sort of closed that. It's now one of those things I have to admit on sort of forms. Have you ever had an alias? And I have to go, yeah, all right.
There's a phrase that you used in one of the interviews. I think it might have been with Dustin Illingsworth, the relative wholeness of other people. And that to me seems to be like again, one of the reasons I found the book so easy to relate to, and in fact, almost, insidious in its way of the thoughts of the narrator aligning with thoughts that I've had, is, I think many of us go through, especially if we're more introverted than extroverted, we go through the world thinking everybody else has got it. And we're, we're the imposters. And yet if your account, your narration in this book relates to me, it's because that's actually not uncommon to have that sensation, I think.
Yeah, I would agree. It's not that uncommon, and I've become more aware of that as time goes on. But also how there's more understanding of how we are kind of multiple in different ways to think about what's going on. But there is this assumption. There's always this assumption we're dealing with. When we deal with so-called or interact with another person, it's a one whole rational, reasonable, thoughtful individual. I mean, how many times have we had, and that's one of the things that I've been fascinated with in my work. We're often telling stories about other people and how they interact and what they did. And then we're often hearing those other stories from other people. And there's often so many layers of this, and that's so interesting, how we experience other people's experiences, which often are the experiences of stated other people. And but some of those narratives are often about how the person could have said this and I would have understood. Why did they say that? There's kind of this incomprehension that another person could be quote unquote irrational when it would be so easy for them to say this thing. And that's always been interesting to me. Why, you think it's so easy for them just to say this thing. And it's not. It's a mountain, it's a boulder, it's
oh yeah.
It's a boulder on top of the mountain. Yeah.
It takes a lot of work to be effortless. So to speak.
Yeah. And who knows how those people experience themselves.
Well,
Something that
at least
really,
from my
oh,
experience, there's two types. I mean, there truly are people who are effortless, and very often because there's not much there, they really are. I think there are people who pretty much live on the surface. I know people in my life like that, but I don't think that's the majority. I think more of us have the second and third and 18th thoughts about everything we do, and then replay the scenes, even something as simple as running into a neighbor on the street and having a 1.5 minute interaction, and then you think about that the rest of the day. I suspect that's the majority of mankind, but I could be wrong. That could be projection anyway.
so something I wanted to say about that really struck me about this book was how intensely the narrator lives in her own head, but also how much her physicality is captured throughout the book. And I think that's a marvelous tension that, she's so in her head, and then she notices she has the blisters, and she puts and I've done that a million times in my life. I mean, it's just very visceral and relatable. And so, again, like the concertina, the back and forth between those two things is beautifully captured, and such a common experience that people don't write about often enough.
Well, that's an interesting thought, Julie, because there's the experience of being the body that has the thoughts and has the thoughts in real time and experiences what it means to be thinking or being taken up by thoughts when we're interacting. We're not sitting, or sometimes we could be lying in a bed, and not what that means. Yeah, what it means for thoughts to be going on in a person who has a body. Yeah. And so someone's written something in there in the chat. I wonder, what did they?
Oh, I didn't see that there. Yep.
Or running into your one-time school friend while carrying a broken printer. Yeah.
I'd also, if I can just take up that that tension between the body and the mind, but also one of the things I just love this book insanely to a huge degree. I was very excited when I saw it was this month's Wafer-Thin book. But I guess the tension between, and you've talked about this a bit already, but inside and outside, or private and public, and walking is such a terrific thing for that, because on the one hand, you're very much in your own mind, thinking, you're carried by the rhythm of your own thoughts as you get into the rhythm of the stride, but you're also kind of in this networked space. You're on the public street, there are other people around, there is a kind of these interested, like there's, and this is going back to James's point about the multiple layers, right? Because there's the layering of times, but also the layering of the networks of the character's own memories and the physical space that she's moving through, and those kind of public systems that shape the world that she's in. And that, I don't know, I think what the novel is for is that encounter between internal thought or subjectivity and a bigger world. I think that's what the novel is kind of meant to do. But I also totally see why you had to invent this new form to do it, because I've never seen it done as well as this, I don't think. I'm just rambling now, but that's I guess those the thoughts that I am having. And you can also, I guess Panthers
You're having the thoughts right now.
Yes, thank you. I'm trying to externalize them into the world, and I'm not sure how well it's going. But Panthers Museum of Fire also is like, it's a public sign. It's like government infrastructure. It's publicly funded. It's this big universal thing, but it's also completely opaque, and it doesn't exist anymore. And it has a set of idiosyncratic meanings to the narrator. So yeah, thank you. It's a very good book.
Did the structure of the walk, I think going to Julia's point about, you could have written this book with the narrator sitting in her apartment simply having thoughts. But then we would lose this, the dark leaves, shiny leaves with the gray dustiness underneath, which is what, anybody who's walked by a hedge like that knows. That's, that sort of satisfying and creepy physical sensation that you have from seeing and touching leaves like that. And you know, that goes throughout the book. Did the structure of the walk, I mean, was that something that you kind of decided upon?
Mm. I don't know if I don't know when, or there are, I guess there are resonant spaces or places in the city that have connections, and I sort of went between them. I mean, a lot of the narrator needs to work because she's just left with this kind of feeling. What do I do with this? And also there's this, if you like, this problem of, I mean, the sister Pamela, I mean, you know, first of all, she's given the manuscript, and there's like, yeah, sorry, at the funeral, and there's this kind of explicit kind of, not even invitation, please do this, you know, we want, it means so much to the family if you did this. And there's no way the narrator was going to do that. I mean, she's resisting that. But it's only when the sister changes her mind that's when she stays up late reading it. And then, of course, because the sister wants it returned, so there's this kind of pressure of having to return the manuscript. But it's only when she's told not to read it that she does read it. And so there's pressured space, if you like, between, and she's got to get, well, there's a kind of choice to get there. Also, I mean, if you know, if to go from that point in Glebe to that point in Surrey Hills, it's not that straightforward. You have to catch a, you know, you have to catch a bus, although there is now a tram, but light rail wasn't at the time, I don't think. And the light rail is the slowest light rail in the entire world, and it would get you right round by the fish markets and various other places, and then you'd get to, you know, slowly pull up at Central. It would have not, even if the light rail was there, I don't think that would match the agitation of the narrator. So that, yes, a bus might have got her to the Central bus interchange, but should still need to get to the other side of the station because the train line cuts the city in half there. I mean, there's a couple of ways around, but you have to go a long way around. And well, no, yeah, you would have to, you know, walk all the way that way and all the way that way to get round to the back where Surrey Hills is, and then up the hill, which is quite steep. If anyone's ever walked up for those streets, Surrey Hills, it's quite, you know, they're quite steep streets. And so almost when you need a certain amount of agitation and maybe even anger to sort of get up that hill. That's a tunnel. And the walk has changed. I mean, it's so amazing that Bettina Kaiser, who did the illustrations, took the photos that are in the book. It wouldn't have been in the Kindle edition, but they're in the print edition. And she's done all my covers, actually. Her partner actually is the one who made the like, it's kind of like coincidence, but I won't go into that. Not coincidence, but serendipity. Made the I can see someone's found the book trailer. It's in their Vimeo. He's a writer and does film work. But she actually followed the walk. And at that point she had a young child and a stroller, and they went through, and I love it. I mean, I don't know if we discussed what she was going to do. She was initially going to draw. I wasn't sure what she was going to do, but I love it that she did looking down moments, you know, because, you know, and it's pavement stuff, and it's kind of scribbly kind of things, you know, nothing beautiful. It kind of, I just love that. So that was her discovery. Yeah. And they're all from how that land was then, and who knows if it's like that now.
Right.
Everything changed. In fact, yesterday I was moving a different sort of way past Central, and I looked down because sometimes I to where Marcel's boot repair shop was. The sign, see, it still seems to be there, but there's no Marcel's boot repair because they're opening the retail space for something much swankier. I keep noticing there's so many, all the changes are happening all the time, and I notice it as if I've made this object, which I guess I have in a sense, and the more time passes, the more it's very, very different. It's just a fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Which it is.
One thing that a lot of reviewers noted, or a lot of reviewers compared this book to the work of Thomas Bernhard, which seems to be sort of partly just because they're both, I mean, Bernhard's books are long, paragraph-less, pages and pages of blocks of prose, and there's a little bit of that here, but not. To me, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know. How do you feel about when people pick another writer such as Bernhard, and and that's because that seems to be such a common thing that we do in reviews of books is, well, it's like this. Was Bernhard an influence for you, or is that something that's just coincidental?
Yeah, just discovering Bernhard's writing. I think I remember there was an essay in Heat. Might have even been Seabald on Bernhard. I can't remember, but I came kind of backdoor to. I spent a long time kind of in Fisher Library Stack. Anyone knows Sydney? And how the Fisher Library Stack used to be, just reading anything that I could find and just following. It was just such a blissful time of my existence, and I was able to borrow all these books, and I remember. I think there was a lot of permission once I discovered discovered his work, because in some ways the thought of it's nothing, it's just it's the permission too, because it allowed me to. I mean, there's been many writers that I've come across over the time, and when they're important to me, I mean, I can't kind of. I'm not able to read Bernhard these days, but there was a moment when it was like, but I'd never give my books away, where I thought, yeah, I can, this, it's okay just to narrow in. And I think it was very helpful too, because I came from a family of monologists, so it seemed like reading reality. Yeah, when I was a kid, I was a teenager, my father could. I remember sitting in a car at one point. He'd taken me to the station, and train after train after train after train went by, and there was no way to interrupt him. No, it's just reality. It was wonderful. And that edge of anger that could be in it, that was wonderful to be able to find a way of giving voice and shape to that, because there's so much energy in that. So it's not. I mean, sometimes my books have been compared to someone I haven't read, or I read afterwards and go, oh yeah, I can see that. Had happened to, I had read him, so fair enough. And of course, I'm sure he'd disown, anything, any kind of connection.
No one met his standards, including himself.
Sorry, what was that?
That no one met his standards, including himself, or first and foremost himself.
No,
we hated Austria. I started to think what he'd think of Australia. So
I just had to jump on some, because one of the quotes that I wrote down from the interview with Dustin Illingworth was related to what you just said. Said nothing approached through a monologue can ever be seen entirely, which again, to me, I mean, that's one of the limitations we have as human beings. We can never have a full view of anything, can we? We can only see it with these eyes and hear with these ears, etc., and think about it with our own brain.
And that's what makes it, well, I'm interrupting your question here, but I think that's what makes the machinery that is a novel possible if we have these incomplete elements clashing with each other. And I think that was part of the excitement of realizing, ironically, that a monologue is more able to bring polyphony than certainly a realist narrative, even a realist narrative that's sort of focalized as whoever it is that puts it through one perspective. There's because when you need the rub of the intention to convince somebody else to put it in conflict with other, because often that focalized third person narrative is a little bit sort of protected.
Yeah. Well, it's an artificial construct. It can't not be, we can't have an omniscient. None of us can be omniscient narrators, even though that construct was used for a good health chunk of the history of the novel, right? We're coming up on the end of the hour, and I don't want to abuse your time, but it.
Can I just reply to somebody who's? I know it's Audrey said something about the dinner with Raph includes the construction of dinner and movement. The walking makes a match for the thoughts of either march or wander in thoughts. Okay, yeah, I just want to acknowledge I've just read that.
Right.
And Mariah as loses multiple levels, it immediately came to mind. Okay, yeah, okay. Yeah.
Did anyone else have questions that they wanted to ask, or thoughts on the book that they wanted to bring up while Jen is with us, or before we wrap up?
Jen, I have a question. Who are the writers important to you now? Who inspire you, I guess?
Oh, yeah, good question. Right now, I'm actually what I have, I'm sort of rereading a bit of Stendhal. I love his sort of and I've been rereading something I haven't read for a long time, and I thought I wanted to read, which is Eve Langley. There's some writers, only Australian author writers, readers and authors might know about Eve Langley. Very eccentric, underpublished writer from the 20th century. I'm reading her, and so interesting. Who would be important? So some of those kinds of, Elizabeth Harrow. There's a lot of women actually. Vigdis Hjorth, I really relate to her worlds. I haven't read many, but I can feel a kind of there's some other, some writers in the States.
I just wanted to jump in and mention that there's a biography of Eve Langley. I think it's called The Importance of Being Eve Langley, which is, wow, what a book. I mean, what a life, but it's
she's quite a person, and I gather there's like 10 unpublished manuscripts, probably in Mitchell Library. She's only 2 were published in her lifetime, and
right.
I remember reading her years and years and years ago. Like there's a couple of times that I nearly did doctorates on writers, and there was sort of various reasons stopped last minute. But when I might have done it decades ago, Eve Langley was someone, and so I hadn't reread her work till just really recently. I'm in the middle of White Topi, and totally fascinating. I mean, lots of problematic aspects of her work. I mean, the race, various things are astoundingly problematic, and yet there's so much extraordinary work in it, and very interesting writers. I want to reread more Janet Frame, and so Centenary this year. There's a lot of very interesting writers. Annie Ernaux, I'm still reading more of her work, but very different. But I love her dedication to finding the word, kind of, you know, her dedication to being authentic with voice somehow. Yeah.
Well, Jen, thank you so much for taking this time to join us. I hope I'm not alone, and I'm sure I'm not, in saying that this was a fabulous book to read. A second time for me, but it was a great pleasure to do it, and such a treat to have you join us and offer your perspectives on the book. Most of what I write about it, I have a website called Neglected Books. Mostly I'm dealing with, and I edit a series of reissuing books that have been out of print. So this is one of the rare times I'm actually dealing with a living author.
All right. That's by definition.
So,
yeah.
So it's almost an anomaly. I had to think about it. Well, how do I deal with this? So you've been super generous in your time and your thoughts, and I think we all would like to offer you a round of applause virtually here to say thank you so much for taking the time. I do want to mention for the folks in the group two things, and I will switch just momentarily to this. So yes, next month's book is going to be Waiting by Goretti Kyomuhendo, sorry, which is it's a very powerful book, very slim. I like all of our Wafer-Thins, of course, but it'll be interesting to see. And this is one when James and I came up with the list for the year, we really wanted to make sure that we represented essentially a nice diversity of languages, time frames, and cultures. And so this is unfortunately the only African book that we are dealing with this year. And then I also, looking ahead, to mention, I've been thinking about what reading groups I would run for 2025. I was hoping to do another pilgrimage, Dorothy Richardson's Pilgrimage, but I'm still struggling to get that book. Is actually the copyrighted sections of Pilgrimage are still out of print in the US, and I am working on hopefully being able to bring Pilgrimage back to print as a totality here in the US, but it's not going to happen in 2025. So for 2025, what we're going to do is Anthony Powell's A Dance to the Music of Time. Very nice. It only has 12 volumes, so we can do a book a month, and there will be a website associated and an email list associated with that for anybody who wants to take part. And there'll be more information about that coming out in the next month and a half or so. So with that, thank you, Jen, and thank you everyone for joining us. And we'll see you back in November to talk about waiting. Take care.